Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Meir Soloveichik, and on behalf of the Tikva Fund and AEI, I'm delighted to welcome you to Faith in America, a series of conversations with leading public writers, figures, and intellectuals. The phrase faith in America has two meanings, both of which will serve as subjects and inspiration for our discussions. First, a consideration of the current state of religion in the United States, but also faith in America itself, meaning why we continue to have faith in the endurance of the American experiment and the vision of the founders. The perfect person with which to begin our conversations is therefore Ross Douthat, one of our most interesting writers on religion and American public life. Ross was appointed in 2009 as a columnist for the New York Times, the youngest writer ever to be so appointed. Ross is referred to as one of several conservative columnists for his paper, but the truth is that he's the only op-ed columnist at the Times who writes from within the perspective of traditional religious faith, courageously and eloquently articulating a biblically based worldview for the enthusiastic readership of the New York Times. It's a miracle that you haven't gotten canceled yet, but maybe today's conversation will help set that.
We can aspire.
Well, exactly. We'll try to set that in motion. All jokes aside, Ross spends most of his time writing for an audience that disagrees with him, and he does so always in a thoughtful and therefore persuasive way. Ross is also the author of numerous important books, including Bad Religion, How We Became a Nation of Heretics, and most recently, The Decadent Society, How We Became the Victim of Our Own Success. Ross, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's fantastic to have you here. I'm really so happy to finally meet you in person. I've been reading you for a long time, since you were a blogger writing a memoir about going to Harvard. So the good news is that all we have to discuss today is everything you've written for the past 20 years. So
that sounds good. At least 90% of it I can repudiate and disavow.
Terrific. So
that'll
that will
narrow
cut
things
out.
down.
So that will leave 5
bit.
minutes left
Yep.
for conversation. Terrific. We'll turn in a moment to the larger state of religion in the U.S., but let's begin by talking about you. You've written several times about your own family's religious journey and how you ultimately embraced Catholicism. So maybe talk a little bit about that and how your own story tells us a bit about the diversity and nature of religion in the United States.
Sure. First, I just want to thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure. I'm grateful to AEI and Tikva for making this conversation possible. And I guess our story, it's less my story personally and more my family's story, and maybe particularly my mother's story. But we grew up, or I grew up, as an Episcopalian in southern Connecticut, as I would say sort of part of a group of, sort of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who I think have been trending towards some kind of secularism over the last 50 years or so. And we were sort of rerouted off that track for complicated reasons. In part, my mother had some sort of strong allergic issues and sort of mysterious chronic illnesses that led us to do various unorthodox things, as one does when one has
in
mysterious
your journey
illnesses.
toward orthodoxy.
In our journey, right, exactly,
Yes.
in our journey towards orthodoxy. But she had a friend who invited her to faith healing services that a woman who was literally named Grace was holding in Connecticut high school auditoriums. I'm still not sure how that fit in with separation of church and state rules, but it was on weekends, so maybe it was okay. And my mother had a sort of flat-out experience of the Holy Spirit in a sort of
Pentecostal?
I mean, the word Pentecostal did not appear in the healing services. It was only at some point later that you sort of realize. In fact, really, it's only sort of in hindsight that I would say, okay, that was our Pentecostalist phase, which then shaded into our evangelical phase, which then shaded into our becoming Roman Catholic. But that was basically the arc, that we started in mainline Protestantism and sort of went through Pentecostalism. We were involved briefly in my parents in an attempt to found a small evangelical church at Yale University, which ended unhappily. And then we ended up as Roman Catholics when I was about 16 or 17. So we sort of did a tour of American Christianity that was sort of kicked off by these intense, charismatic religious experiences. And I'm therefore in the unusual position of being neither a cradle Catholic nor an adult convert since I came in as a teenager. So I sort of like to think that I can sort of move between those two, sometimes competing and feuding worlds of Catholic.
And does that give you a deeper understanding as well of the evangelical world, the Protestant?
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to claim too much, like
Yeah.
spending 5 years as an evangelical between the ages of 11 and 14 in southern Connecticut, not like, the heartland of American
exactly.
evangelicalism. It wasn't sort of the most intensive cultural experience that you could possibly have, but yeah, it gave me experience. I find elements of many different, I guess, American Christian faith traditions immediately recognizable from my own childhood. Different styles of rhetoric, different styles of prayer. We're talking here, shortly after there was a rally for Donald Trump on the Washington Mall that had this sort of intense ecumenism. It had Catholics, it had evangelicals, it had all kinds of people, but there was a very strong Pentecostalist vibe that I found totally recognizable
From your...
even, as something that would have been sort of not focused on Donald Trump. That's the sort of fascinating shift, but something that was, would have been totally recognizable to my 11-year-old self. Yeah.
So let's build on that to discuss America. G.K. Chesterton famously described America, this is taking a little bit out of context from the original quote, but he famously described America as a nation with the soul of a church. What exactly do you think that once meant, and to what extent do you think that's true about America today?
Well, Chesterton was famous for taking other people out of context, too.
Sure.
So it's really, I think it's fair play to do whatever we want with that quote. I think the way that's usually interpreted is to mean that it's sort of a version of the conventional point that America is a more creedal nation than other nations, that we have a particular kind of vision of ourselves as, kind of a new church, kind of a new Israel. There's sort of
almost chosen nation.
An almost chosen nation. There's interesting things, in sort of the Protestant reading of the Old Testament at the time of the American founding that then gets sort of taken down into various forms of kind of missionary Americanism, which sometimes is more Christian and sometimes less so, but always has the sense that America is sort of, that you have to believe something to be an American in a way you don't necessarily to be an Englishman or an Italian, and that belief is a sort of moral / theological belief, even if it doesn't have a clearly defined metaphysical picture behind it. So that's, that is, I think, what Chesterton meant.
And are we still a nation with the soul of a church?
I'm not sure. I mean, it's yes, in the sense that aspect of America, this sort of sense of religious mission and the sort of role of politics as sort of fulfilling some kind of unfolding eschatological view, that's still present in our politics in all kinds of ways, on the left as well as the right. But it does seem like there's some much deeper fractures in how people view that mission and what America is and what the American, the idea of a civic religion or civil religion that became sort of powerful for a while, this idea that we'd been Protestant and now we had a sort of Protestant-ish civil religion. That seems to have broken down substantially over the last 40 or 50 years in a way that is pretty novel in American history. Like even when we fought the Civil War, we were fighting it over sort of a point of Protestant theological interpretation.
It's lost, while there may be a certain sense of American exceptionalism, it's lost its link to a biblically literate public and polity. Is that right?
That's part of it, yeah. I mean, I think we... everyone agrees America is still a more religious nation than many of our developed world peers, and even the parts of America that aren't formally religious still seem more religious in their own ways. But there definitely isn't the same kind of biblical common ground. And you have certainly, one of the books you mentioned that I wrote about 10 years ago argued that the best way to understand America in the early 21st century was as a nation of sort of competing Christian heresies, right? With a sort of religious center defined by some mixture of Oprah Winfrey and Joel Osteen, right? Sort of prosperity theology and a kind of therapeutic, psychologized form of Christianity. But I used the word heresy because I thought it was still pretty clearly connected to America's more fully Christian past. And 10 years on, it seems like there's more post-Christianity, more areas of American religion that have gone one step beyond heresy into something that, even if it still has some Christian holdovers, leaves the tradition behind.
So that's precisely where I want to head, so that's great. So you wrote in the book you just referenced, originally you wrote, this is 10 years ago, I guess? 8
11,
years ago.
yeah,
Okay.
10, no, right, 2012. I would have written it 10 years ago,
Yeah.
and
So,
here we are.
10 years ago you wrote, America's problem isn't too much religion or too little of it, it's bad religion. The slow motion collapse of traditional Christianity and the rise of a variety of destructive pseudo-Christianities in its place. So, by pseudo-Christianity you mean self-help, New Age?
Yeah, so at that point I would have said prosperity theology on the right,
the Christian,
if you're going to
right.
sort of
Yeah.
make left-right distinctions, a kind of therapeutic gospel of wellness, sort of, again, in the sort of Oprah Winfrey, Deepak Chopra kind of zone, a kind of Christian nationalism that has cropped up again under Trump that goes beyond almost chosen and just says, no, God has chosen America, and we have this kind of clear destiny in the world. And then at that point, I would have said that sort of there was also a kind of very attenuated liberal Christianity that had become extremely weak and had sort of lost any kind of connection to strong belief, a sense of the supernatural, a sort of strong moral vision. And I spent a lot of time writing about things like the Jesus Seminar, these sort of academic projects to try and extract a appropriately liberal Jesus from the New Testament, right? Reading the sort of Gnostic gospel stuff. I think one thing that's changed since then is that kind of liberal Christianity has in certain ways de-Christianized a little further, but also got this kind of new jolt of life in what now gets called, there's no perfect name for it, but the sort of the Great Awakening, right? This sort of movement towards a more sort of strident and comprehensive vision around race, sex, gender, these kind of issues that really feels like a kind of Protestant revivalism without the Protestantism.
So right, so what is that? So it seems to me
Good question.
Yeah,
what is it?
So it's not so much in the spirit of repudiation, right? What you wrote before, not that you're actually repudiating it, but in other words,
amending.
Yeah, amending, right? Revise and extend your remarks. So you're saying now you would say it's not so much that the problem is that America just has bad religion. Would you agree that now America's problem, at least in part, is that it just has too little religion? Meaning, what I mean by that is even if all those people who are in some sense devout, that you describe as versions of Christian heresy, because they're focused less on doctrine, dogma, more on self-help,
right, or
prosperity, gospel, etc. Even if you take all those people and put them in sort of the religious camp, the fact is that right now a vast part of America's youth and elites would be placed among the now infamous nuns, right? Meaning no religious affiliation at all.
Well, so this is I think a key question, because the answer to your question is I'm not sure. I'm very comfortable saying that America has a problem of too little institutional religion, right? And that this is a problem sort of up and down the different classes and hierarchies of American society, right? That sort of the collapse of sort of church culture plays a big role in social breakdown in working class America, right? It plays a big role in the opioid epidemic. There's actually some academic literature that I hope to write on at some point soon, actually tracing sort of secularization and social breakdown in working class life. So that's happening at the bottom, and then at sort of, in the middle class, upper middle class, among the intelligentsia, the failure of institutional religion means that you're losing I mean, in addition to the possibility that the institutions might be actually have true things to say,
Right.
you're just losing sort of connections to
The Tocquevillian aspect of
the
it.
Tocquevillian aspect, but also sort of just these intellectual traditions that let people sort of test their ideas against a certain amount of, shall we say, accumulated wisdom, right? And also prevent them from sort of just transferring religious impulses directly into politics, which is something that's clearly happening a lot. So all of that, that's the decline of institutional religion. But then, if you look at sort of, the people we call the nones, right, the people who have no religious affiliation, and you look at what's happened among them in the last 5 years, it's not just the sort of rise of wokeness and sort of social justice zeal. It's also, the return of things like astrology, right, that were really big with my parents' generation. And then by the time I got to college, no one would ever ask you what your sign was
right.
in 1999. But in 2020, they will. And there's sort of an uptick in various forms of New Age spirituality. There's an uptick in witchcraft and paganism. And there's a question, right, with all this stuff, like how sincere is it? Like the witches who want to hex Brett Kavanaugh, right? Is that religion or performance? But something is going on there that's not just secularization.
Right,
I
well,
think.
and you wrote a column about the return of paganism.
Right.
Curious how the New York Times readers responded to that.
I didn't read all the
Yeah,
comments.
I thought somebody would say, finally, somebody, he's on to us, so shut it down. But it goes beyond just what you're describing of the horoscopes, etc. I mean, you have Anthony Kronman, the former dean of Yale Law School, I think it was the dean when my wife was there, wrote a book calling himself a born-again pagan. Where Jews are celebrating Hanukkah now, one of the most famous attacks on Hanukkah in print was Christopher Hitchens' essay that he wrote in the 90s called Ba Hanukkah, that he hates Hanukkah because had the Jews in Judea been defeated by the Hellenists, all we would have was Hellenism.
Right.
And thanks to the Jews, now there's Christianity and Islam, so we ruined Western civilization by allowing monotheism to survive. So there is a certain element, even among the elite, of a total lack of biblical literacy, meaning no interest in the Bible, I think, even as something important to understand the development of Western civilization. And then both in high culture and low culture, let's say like Avatar, a celebration of the divinization of nature. Is this secularism or is this?
Yeah, it doesn't feel like secularism to me. But it also, this was one thing I tried to explore in that column. It's not clear that it's a new sort of, well, it's very clear that it's not a new institutional alternative. There are covens for witches, and I mean, there are sort of, reading groups for New Age books and so on, but there's no sort of, no one's going to set themselves up as Pontifex Maximus and start doing entrail readings, right, and the Chrysler Building or something just yet, right? I mean, the whole apparatus of ancient paganism was built around sort of, rituals of the city, right? Rituals that were sort of bound and connected to politics, and it feels like we've got a ways to go before the new paganism. I mean, there's such a huge gap, for instance, between what Anthony Kronman is describing in his book, which is basically a sort of Walt Whitman-esque vision of sort of aesthetic rapture and communion with nature, and what's happening with like people reading their horoscopes and sort of that kind of thing. And that doesn't mean it can't all fit together. You have very different forms of Christian practice that all fall under the umbrella of Christianity. But it's hard to know how it takes shape. But right now it does seem like this incredibly influential, if also somewhat formless, shape in American religious life.
And cultural life as well.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Yes, totally. I mean, you have like, it's sort of, I think there's still a sort of pretty strong materialist bias in places like, let's say, Yale Law School, right? That extends to certain parts, it sort of extends across the upper reaches of the intelligentsia. So if you go into the intelligentsia and you say, look, I really believe in ghosts, right? People are going to raise their eyebrows at you. And so this zone of kind of play acting where you're sort of, looking at your horoscope and maybe it's real and maybe it's not, or you're doing a hex and maybe it's real and maybe it's not, that's sort of a safe zone for elites to play in, I think, without going all the way to some kind of commitment to saying actually real supernatural spirits that we're invoking exist.
Right. I guess, and this is all we could say about this, I guess, but when you think about something that's sort of in between the two poles of what you're talking about, if you walked into, to take your example, Yale Law School, and you spoke about recycling not just as a prudent thing to do, but as a daily ritual,
yes.
what Jews would call a mitzvah.
Yes.
Or if you spoke about your notions of formally accepted categories amongst the sexes, or philosophy of family life, and you spoke about it in creedal terms as if the biblical vision is wrong and needs to be overthrown. Those two things, if you think about it, the ritualization of nature, related activities, debates over the nature of family, those aren't all that dissimilar to the debates between Jews and Hellenists in Second Temple Judea.
Yeah. No, there's a lot. I think if you work at the level of, definitely the level of moralism,
right,
and maybe, as you say with the recycling
that's
example,
not David Hume.
The level, right, the level of
yeah.
sort of practice, of sort of intentional practice. There is an incredibly, there's a much stronger religious energy at a place like Yale Law School than there was in elite education when I was passing through 20 years ago,
right.
Unquestionably. But there still isn't, I think, a clear lift up to a metaphysics. People are sort of comfortable for now with the idea that we have renewed moral zeal around these issues. We have a set of sort of new emergent moral principles around sex and race, maybe. And we have a set of practices that are sort of, religious practices or ritualized practices. But we don't have a metaphysical story that makes it all fit together. And what I have wondered about for a while is how long does that go on, right? Can you sort of sustain religious practices and religious morals without a religious world picture?
Or will there be a Julian the Apostate who sort of shows up and tries to reinstall some sort of
Christian? Well, this is the
larger,
right.
Anti-Christian, pagan.
The proper
world.
Julian the Apostate under this situation would be the Christian who somehow becomes, president of Harvard and attempts to restore Congregationalist worship.
I have to say, all cards on the table, I have a soft spot for Julian the Apostate because he did try to rebuild the temple.
No, I would imagine.
In Jerusalem, so.
But was not permitted to do so.
He failed through a series of natural.
Not permitted.
There's various versions of what happened there. We don't need fake news about what happened there. We can revisit that another time. One more point on the culture. So. In the recent 65th anniversary issue of National Review, you argued that one area where we can call it, I guess, the ecumenically religious conservative movement has failed entirely is in its attempt to impact the culture, which is now, as we mentioned, largely devoid of a biblical perspective. And you essentially argue, I think you conclude by arguing that absent the evangelization of America, or I guess a Great Awakening or something like that, the traditionally religious cannot recapture the culture. That seemed to be your conclusion, that we're not waiting. It's not good enough to wait, as you said, I think for a St. Benedict, you need to wait for a St. Paul, is how you put it.
Yes, that was how I concluded.
So I'm curious what strategy you think religious communities, such as mine or yours, should adopt before this evangelization, meanwhile, and in the current state. So you're a very interesting case because you certainly have not shut out the culture. You write movie criticism, you're very much engaged with the culture. At the same time, it's safe to say that you're, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're certainly thinking about, I can assume, as someone raising with your wife 4 Catholic children, precisely because you know so much about the American culture that you're engaging is hostile to so much that you believe. You must be thinking about what to teach them about it, how to introduce them to it. And it's not all that, it's the different, it's similar to someone such as myself, someone who's interested in the culture, who engages the culture, but is trying with my wife to raise 6
Yeah.
Orthodox Jewish children. So I'm curious how you think about this tension, what you intend to teach your children about a culture that I think detests so much of what you're trying to teach to them.
That's a good question. The short answer is that I'm not completely sure. Our oldest child is 9. She'll be 10 soon. And, they have some sort of, I think they have a general sense that, their father's perspective on the world and sort of the official perspective of progressive New Haven culture are a little bit different.
Right.
But I haven't sort of sharpened that to the finest possible point, I think, yet. And sort of, yeah, there are certain issues that I have not talked about with them yet that I will probably end up talking with them about in the next 3 years or something, so I can come back and tell you how some of those things go. But I think there's sort of there are a couple challenges here, right? One is just the challenge of the particular challenge of Catholicism right now, which is, Catholicism is the largest religion in the United States. The largest, it's not
slightly larger than Orthodox Judaism.
Slightly larger than Orthodox Judaism, right? It's not, and it sprawls, right? There's a Catholic Church everywhere. There are, 17 million different kinds of Catholics.
Right.
There's this incredible range from, the most traditionalist to not just sort of the most liberal, but people whose relationship to the church is not at all defined by the kind of categories that like pundits use, right? Like there are plenty of people who don't think of themselves as liberal Catholics or conservative Catholics, who just think of themselves as sort of lukewarm Catholics, who sort of move in and out of the church and maybe drift to their local evangelical church for a while and drift back. And it's just a very complex picture. And that means that it can be simultaneously the case that it's really important, I think, for the Catholic Church to sort of, and for individual Catholics to sort of think about kind of Benedictine institution building, right? Like, how do you build more resilient forms of sort of a more particularist and zealous Catholicism that can withstand a hostile culture? But also to recognize that the church has responsibility for this, really big flock of baptized Catholics who are all the church's responsibility, even if, they're not practicing or, practicing intermittently or all of these things. And that's just, I feel like that's a very different world from the world of Orthodox Judaism, right? Which, has, I think having an intense community surrounded by a hostile culture is something that, Judaism has been doing for a very, very long time. It's, there's a lot of sort of built up wisdom and experience about that. And also it's sort of assumed in, you can correct me if you think, but sort of, I feel like the sort of essential theory of Judaism assumes that that's sort of going to be the Jewish position. Yeah. Up until, the big moment, right? And the Catholicism has much more of sort of, it expands, it contracts, it rules empires, it's persecuted. And so figuring out what kind of zone you're in at this moment is, I think, it's a distinctive challenge. And it's also something that I struggle with personally, because I don't have the temperament of separatist, I guess. I sort of admire people who separate from the culture more fully than I do, and expect them to spend less time in purgatory, and but I don't have that temperament, and I'm trying to figure out what kind of temperaments my kids have. Like, I came to Catholicism, I had this sort of weird religious upbringing, but I also went to liberal leaning, my high school was sort of filled with liberal Jews. It was, a very Holocaust-focused kind of historical curriculum in certain ways. Then I went to Harvard, secular. Right. And and I felt like my Catholicism sort of flourished in being defined against the sort of consensus that I was within, and that sort of fit my temperament. So part of me wants to give my kids something to rebel against that isn't Catholicism, you know, to sort of, and so they are. I mean, they're not at a Catholic school at the moment, but maybe that's a big mistake. And yeah, I mean, anyway, I'm rambling a little bit.
No,
but
it's fascinating.
It seems to me that in the end, you have to have some faith that, you know, your children come to you, as you know, since you have more of them than I do, as people.
It's not a contest,
right.
but I have more.
But you have more,
yeah.
right? So, and they come to you as people, and your parenting makes a difference and has some directional effect on them. But each of my children has had a particular temperament and a particular set of gifts and challenges that have been evident from very early in their lives. And the more children you have, the less deluded you become about your.
That's the terrifying aspect.
Right. It's terrifying, but you also have to find some comfort in it and say, you know, in the end, I'm trying to give my children a gift, which is a, you know, ancient religious tradition that I think tells a true story about the world, and I'm going to do my best to give them that gift. And, you know, it's in certain ways between them and God what happens beyond that. But that also, again, sort of reflects the fact that we're not, you know, my family is not in a social world that's really anything like the world of Orthodox Judaism, which is built up to sort of, you know, to create this clear social space in which you can live your life as an observant Jew with these kind of supports. And, you know, it's just that sort of exists in pieces and bits in American Catholicism, but it doesn't really exist in anything like the same way.
It's so interesting to hear you say that, and I want to talk more about the diversity of Catholicism in America in a moment, but the contrast that you raised between Orthodox Judaism and Catholicism touched on something that I always think about in a sort of fantastical way. I think we're around the same age. I think we probably both grew up reading Father Newhouse and First Things. And you know, as you remember from his writings in the 1990s, there was a great deal of confidence, I think, about the project. And Father Newhouse would speak about what he called the Catholic moment.
Yep.
And by that he meant that he thought that the Catholic world, the Catholic Church, was best situated to actually give an account to Americans about what America would be. I mean, it would take the leadership, I guess, of what he saw as a conservative moment. And obviously there are, you know, the aspects of that project that hasn't worked out. Just to put it mildly. And so sometimes now, in the face of all the problems that you're diagnosing, as I read you in your books, I sometimes wonder whether this is the Orthodox Jewish moment. And I know that sounds crazy because we're a tiny, we're like 10% of 2% of America. But what I mean by that is that within the more traditionally religious or conservative world, maybe we need more voices to highlight how you can be, as Abraham put it, both a stranger and a neighbor in society. And maybe that vision can speak to other religious communities, not to make them Jewish, just to help.
No, I think
help them survive. I don't know if that's crazy, but it is something I think about.
I think that's very plausible. I mean, I think one way to look at a lot of the bigger Christian traditions in the U.S. is to say that they contain within them communities that resemble Orthodox Judaism and stand in a similar relationship to other pieces of Protestantism or Catholicism as the Orthodox do in relation to conservative and Reform Judaism. But again, yeah, I think there is this kind of built-up mix of expectation and practice in terms of what it means to sort of maintain yourself as a community in a context where you don't ever expect to become culturally dominant, that a lot of those Christian communities can probably learn something from. But with the further wrinkle, right, that, you know, much more
You're
than Judaism.
You're a global movement, right?
Well, and the idea of evangelization is just, you know, historically and theologically much more central, right? So it's hard. There isn't an exact pattern of mapping, but you know, you could say, right, that like, you know, Mormonism in the United States is this sort of Christian offshoot that has combined this sort of even more fierce than other Christian communities commitment to missionary work and conversion, but also resembles Orthodox Judaism in its attempts to sort of build these kind of structures.
They've built up infrastructures of which Orthodox Jews in America could only dream.
Right.
I mean, they have incredible infrastructure they built up.
And there's no, there isn't, like when I went out to Utah and got various tours during the Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
Was this during the Mitt Romney?
No,
moment,
it was
or?
after. But they told me a lot of stories about how hilarious it was to get like all of a sudden newspaper reporters coming to
to see how.
I think they told me that they couldn't believe that a brain surgeon would take off time to volunteer in like a food kitchen or something like that. That
it puts the Mormon infrastructure puts. I think it should put Catholics and Protestants alike to shame. But there's also, there's something so distinctive. The Mormons, recapitulated a sort of, Jewish Exodus, promised land kind of narrative in a way that, again, the spread of American Catholicism through ethnic communities, there's no sort of equivalent of that to
No, you're absolutely right.
Upon.
I mean, when they picked me up from the airport, church leadership, and they'd say, show me the Salt Lake, and they say it's just like the Dead Sea, and it's
well, if you
there's a real.
Can you imagine coming through those mountains
and then all
as
of a sudden
Mormon
seeing
pioneer,
and
it's
seeing
like,
the Dead Sea?
Well, yeah,
right here.
This is what is what God prepared for you.
Yeah. So I'd love to get your thoughts a little bit more about the state of, I guess, more conservative American Catholicism. The past 4 years has had a lot of political and religious surprises, some distressing, some delightful. But one of the most surprising for me has been a growing chorus of voices. Sometimes they're people who I read with great interest and learn a great deal from them, arguing that the basically American founding was a mistake and the source of all of our problems today. So obviously you have this in Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. And I want to say I share a great deal of his distress about the state of our culture and society, as I assume you do. But he draws a direct line, basically, from, what he calls the 250-year-old experiment with liberalism that is America, leaving aside that, in fact, I think America, as we mentioned before, was once not just classical liberalism, but a nation of the soul of a church. Then you have renewed discussions of Catholic integralism, which I'm not really sure what is being sought. Maybe I don't know, seems to yearn for the restoration of the Habsburg Empire or something like that.
I mean, don't we all?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe not.
Maybe
not.
Listen, let me just say, the Habsburg Empire, we could talk, but when I hear discussions about how awesome Spanish 1492 was, that's where I get off,
There are different branches of the
yes,
Habsburg family.
Right, exactly.
Have different relations.
Depends where you get off, depends what they're looking for. So how prominent are these strands of thoughts? Are these minor? What's going on here? What's inspiring these currents? I'd love.
How
your
long
thoughts.
do you have?
Yeah, we could take as long as we want.
Well, I mean, so it started. Yeah. So you can sort of, go back to the 1990s, right? Go back to sort of the confident vision of Father Richard John Newhouse, which basically was the idea that, okay, you'd had this sort of central institutional form of Christianity in the U.S., mainline Protestant churches, and they had sort of both liberalized and fallen apart simultaneously in the 60s, leading America into sort of social chaos and secularization. But then along comes this new alternative, which is sort of centered around the Catholic Church that has gone through the Second Vatican Council, has had its encounter with modernity and is ready to evangelize the modern world, and then in alliance with an evangelicalism that has sort of left fundamentalism behind and become modernized itself, and an American Judaism, right? That has which after the Holocaust and after Vatican II, that Christians have finally recognized the deep sin of anti-Semitism, and we are in dialogue with our Jewish brothers and sisters for the first time. And there's this zone of ecumenical common ground between different conservative forms of religious faith that had never existed before. Right. And out of this, you can build a new religious center for the U.S. That's 20 years ago. So what happens after that? Well, there's sort of a peak period for this idea under the presidency of George W. Bush. The evangelical with Jewish and Catholic advisors, with his council of bioethicists and so on, who is speaking the language of Catholic social teaching, not just sort of a hard-edged libertarianism. And 9/11 happens, and there's this moment of sort of, crusade, right?
Renewed sense of purpose.
Mission, purpose, and so on. And all of that comes to grief. The Iraq War, the Bush administration, the financial crisis, the political side of it, all comes to grief. And on the religious side, Catholicism suddenly gets hit by wave upon wave of sex abuse scandals that call into question, I think, much of the narrative of sort of recovered Catholic vitality after the 1960s that people like Newhouse were invested in. Because if this recovered vitality coexisted with so much cover-up, so many crimes, what did it actually mean? Right. And then, sort of one step beyond that, you have, sticking with Catholicism, you have the accession of Pope Francis, who reveals that some kind of liberalizing Catholicism has a lot more life in it and a lot more support behind it within the institutional church than people writing for First Things in the year 2000 ever assumed. There was an assumption that after John Paul II,
right, you have Ratzinger,
after
all of a sudden
Benedict, right, Catholicism has, there's sort of the papacy has righted the ship and established this is what the church believes. Right. The craziness of the 70s is behind us. And then Francis comes along and flings open arguments again. And then you also have events, sort of political economy events, right? Like not just the financial crisis, but sort of general trends associated with globalization, deindustrialization, that all call into question sort of the economic optimism of the 90s. And out of all of this, in politics, you get Donald Trump. In religion, you just get a lot of skepticism about the Newhouse vision, about that kind of optimism. And this skepticism goes in a lot of different directions. What you're describing from Patrick Deneen and the integralists is one direction, right? It's a very Catholic direction, and it says, look, we have we have all this accumulated Catholic political thought that goes back hundreds, if not thousands of years, about the proper relationship of the institutional church and society, that they should be integrated, and we threw all this out, but look where it got us. We want to look again at that. So that's one thing that happens, but then you also have, what I've seen in the Francis era is, there's also just sort of a kind of paranoid style in Catholicism, where it's this sense of like, well, if the Pope is against us, if the Pope is a liberalizer, then this is an apocalyptic moment. And if it's an apocalyptic moment, then you're only a few steps away from Archbishop Vigano, the anti-Francis whistleblower, delivering these sermons about how the battle between Trump and Biden is the children of light versus the children of darkness. I think that stuff is actually more culturally significant than what the integralists are doing. But I mean, I think what I would say for the integralists, right, is that they are, in the Catholic context, they want a Catholicism that offers a sort of a comprehensive worldview, not just a sort of partisan program, right? I think that's the case for the integralist moment, is that it's looking for a Catholicism that says, here's what a good society looks like, not just here are the two issues you have to vote on in order to be a good Catholic Republican.
So I, obviously, as an Orthodox Jew, I understand what it means to look to the wisdom of the past and to believe that there are many things before the Enlightenment that can teach us great things. Obviously, I live much of my, and everybody I live with lives based on those rules. I guess I'm just sort of struck by the anger at the founding specifically sometimes. So, I'll give you an example. I just sort of was struck with this. I just screenshot it off Twitter. This was,
well, it's on Twitter, so you can't.
It's got to be.
We haven't even talked about the internet. Right?
I'll tell you. So this is from a young Catholic writer, Matthew Walther, the editor of a new Catholic magazine. So during the debate over
which publishes Protestants and Jews.
Sure.
By the way, it's not. I wouldn't describe his magazine as like a hard-edged integral.
No, right, agreed. Right. So during the debate over the 1619 project, which we're not going to go into now, but we have to make some things easy for you. But he just tweeted this out, in the midst of something. He said, he wrote, "It seems strange to me that Catholics would reject the premise that 1776 was a lie and that the first order principle of the American project was brutalization." Now, I don't even know what he means. Meaning, why would Catholics specifically embrace the premise that the first order project of the principle of the American project was brutalization? Does he mean against Catholics? I mean,
I don't want to speak for Matthew.
Yes.
So, but I guess
I'm just trying to understand.
Sure. So if you again, it depends. Once you decide that I don't know if Matthew decided this. He's younger than I am, and I don't think was probably deeply invested in, the Catholic neoconservatism of 1999. But once
didn't grow up reading the public square.
Well, right. But once you say that, once you stop thinking that there's sort of an easy place that your religion fits into the American political landscape, right? And once you start regarding your religion as more of a critique / alternative, then you start rolling back the clock a bit, right? And you say, well, okay, so where exactly did America go wrong, right? So what are the problems that led to the current moment, and so on? And if you're a Catholic, the Catholic history in this country is, it's a very complicated history.
Sure,
right?
But sure.
Right.
And there was probably more anti-Catholicism than anti-Semitism at its time of the founding.
I would say in this country.
Right, but there were also Catholics who signed the Declaration of Independence.
There were.
Right.
Yes. Who are your?
And one of them.
Who are you civilizationally rooting for? Right. So let's take the example of, if you're a Catholic and you look back at 1756 to 1763, right? So it's a seven years war, right?
Yeah.
And are you glad the English won that war? As an American, obviously you are, because we don't want to grow up speaking French and these terrible things. But but you can tell a story, and I've had Catholics tell versions of this story to me where you say, look, a lot of what was wrong with a lot of the things the U.S. did that were distinctly bad were intimately connected to a certain kind of Anglo-Protestant, view of the world. And in fact, for instance, the French Canadians had much better relations with Native Americans, right? And the American revolutionaries, just wanted to push the frontier westward and were motivated by fear of Catholics in Quebec, right?
And they would argue by a biblically based notion of them as a chosen nation, et cetera,
right? Which is not right, which is sort of a displacement of something that Catholics are supposed to think about the Church. Anyway, I don't think this is necessarily what Matthew is thinking.
It's very interesting to me.
It's sort of
distressing, but interesting to me.
Right. And to go back to sort of the Habsburg question, right? Yeah, you do end up with, if you are a Catholic who becomes skeptical of American liberalism, and you go back to the 18th century, you may find yourself suddenly more sympathetic to France and Spain than you do to England, and this in turn, and maybe more sympathetic to, the Native American position than, there's sort of this is the weird place where, deep reactionary Catholicism and sort of woke critiques of the American founding overlap.
Which
right?
I think that's why I ask about it, because.
But then they don't perfectly overlap, because of course the woke are hate Junipero Serra, and the Catholic missionaries are seen as villains in California.
Columbus, right?
And Columbus, right? So it's not a precise overlap, but there's I think that's part of where that's coming from. Yeah.
One more question just related to this, but not on this directly. Just to counterpose to you a different Catholic model, which I'm pretty taken with now, which is that of Amy Coney Barrett. So you have this woman who, brilliance, has been formed not only in the academy, but probably first and foremost within her own unique religious community, which is Catholic, but also beyond Catholic.
Right.
Almost like a 19th century Tocquevillian covenantal association, almost literally. Comes to the White House, speaks about her incredible multiracial family as her true achievement, but then also says, I love the U.S. Constitution. Speaks of the Senate, right in their face and says, I believe in the power of prayer, and I know that people are praying for me. Now, you've written about the possibility that Barrett could become a sort of cultural
Bader Ginsburgian icon, yes.
And I found that fascinating because I know that there are many Orthodox Jews who were struck positively by how, if you excuse the phrase, the dogma lives loudly inside her. So do you think that she could point to sort of another way forward for the Catholic relationship with America and for the conservative movement, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I find her most interesting in terms of religious conservatism or traditional biblical religion, you know, whatever phrase you want to use, in terms of our relationship with feminism, actually.
Right, that's what you wrote about in your column.
Yeah, and so I've thought about her less in terms of her view of America, mostly because I assume that, you know, integralism is not yet a sufficiently powerful enough force to, like, become pretty meaningful for Supreme Court debates, right? I assume that almost anyone...
That was a big yet you put in there.
Right. Anyone nominated to the Supreme Court right now from the right is going to have Richard John Newhouse's view of the American founding and not maybe Matthew Walther's.
Right. But this is not Scalia. She didn't go to Harvard. She didn't go... I mean, she's coming from her own uniquely Catholic, particularistically Catholic.
Yes.
That's what I found so interesting about it.
Yeah. And I guess, but to me, the question there is sort of, to what extent can religious traditions sort of sift and integrate insights from the social revolutions of the 60s and 70s without just becoming sort of, you know, as I think more liberal traditions have done, just sort of surrendering to them. And so the capacity to be able to say it is both good, you know, for Amy Coney Barrett to be a wife and mother of 7 children, and also it's good to have her gifts fulfilled in this incredibly important professional office. And we can say that it's good that she has those opportunities that would not have been available to, with the exception of Elizabeth Anscombe, right? A similarly placed woman 70 or 100 years ago. I think that's tremendously important for the future of serious Christianity or serious Judaism
and religious women in general.
Yes,
and everybody.
And that, yeah, I mean that, and that to me is, you know, it's not the only impediment, but the assumption that being traditionally religious means living in pre-1965 America in every way, I think is an impediment to religious witness right now. That, like, you know, you have, obviously, there are people for whom the sort of, you know, the sort of pure trad vision of male-female relations and the domestic sphere and its relation to the working sphere, there are people for whom that's incredibly appealing. But there's also, I think, a larger number of people who, you know, who are sort of drawn to certain elements of that world, who are, you know, will say, yeah, you know, it makes sense to have, you know, for the man to be more often the breadwinner and all these kinds of things. But you also have to be able to say that, you know, women have gifts that were not sufficiently exercised in the world of the past, and it's good for them to be able to exercise them in the world of the present. You know, in the context of Catholicism, right? I mean, you know, there are things that Pope Francis has done that I've been very critical of, but, you know, appointing women to higher offices in the Vatican bureaucracy, for instance, I think is a very good thing. Saying that, you know, there's no reason why a nun can't lead a dicastery, one of these technical terms, in Rome. I think that's all to the good. And I think, you know, for the sort of modern liberal mind, the idea that you could have a church that simultaneously retains an all-male priesthood, but also has, you know, women in real positions of sort of meaningful authority, that seems like a contradiction in terms. I don't think it's a contradiction, and I think it's actually the synthesis that a lot of religious communities need. But, you know, we'll see.
Fascinating. I want to close out by asking you just a few quick questions about decadence and the subject of your new book. Very important. Available on Amazon now.
A great Hanukkah present.
A great Hanukkah present. Nothing. much of what we celebrate,
or send it to your
much
of
how
Gentile
we celebrate
friends.
Hanukkah is by celebrating decadence. That's what it's all about, the holiday of decadence. So just to summarize, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, but so your current book argues that we're effectively victims of our own success, that we are sclerotic, we turn into zombies by our screens, that culturally we're not creative, that 50 years after the moon landing we've stopped truly seeking great breakthroughs, and also, not to mention, we're committing demographic suicide by stopping to have children. That's
that's a good summary. That we're more Western civilization, whatever it is now, is more stuck and stagnant than it is hurtling towards either apocalypse or the singularity. Right.
So, and it's really fascinatingly laid out in the sweep of history, and also from your own perspective of as a critic of what's happened in movies and TV, which was and an attempt, I think, to deflate what is known as the golden age of television, is basically totally robbed from 1970s movies, or
to some extent. I mean, the golden age. It's possible to have, good TV shows even under decadence. I want to stress
Listen,
that. Right.
We all agree nothing will be the A-Team, that was a high point. And
the remake of the A-Team, though.
No, but there was
they
a
already
remake
did
of it,
the
and
remake,
it was terrible.
right? And it was
one of the
terrible.
most disappointing moments of my life, really.
I'm sorry.
I don't want to, as a child of the 80s, but we don't have to get into difficult subjects like that. So I'm wondering first, and I think there's an obvious question that probably you've been thinking about, but maybe not, whether the stunning success of the development of the vaccine. Michael Brennan-Doherty, I think is a friend of yours, said something a couple weeks ago, and that struck me, and I wrote it down when he said it because I thought it was so interesting. He said that that story speaks to America's particular genius. The way he put it is that a lot of the particular rancor aimed at the lockdowns are connected to something in the American character, but that also produces these kinds of achievements, so that they're the two sides of the same coin. So on the one hand, it's a difficult place to govern. You wrote about gridlock in America. But it also sort of at these moments sort of achieves great things, far beyond what anyone, including Fauci, even Bill Nye, the science guy, said it would take at least 2 years, and if as great as expert as him, right, was, we could defy those. So I'm wondering if that has impacted your thinking about this at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the book came out literally like 4 weeks
before the vaccine,
before the first lockdowns.
Oh, before the
lockdowns. Yeah. So I was doing book promotion, just before the world shut down, and I think I wrote then that you could see this as, it wasn't ideal for book sales, but it was sort of providentially a test of decadence, like how decadent are we really? Because we're facing this. Pandemic was in certain ways the biggest challenge that the developed world had faced sort of on a comprehensive scale in a very long time. And I think the answer is that we look more decadent in certain ways than we did before, and less decadent in others. And the vaccine is obviously a mark on the less decadent side. And I think you can see a bunch of places where, this is sort of an extreme example, because we literally just tried to clear all the roadblocks out of the way, and there was this incredible time pressure and so on. But there are other examples where it seems like maybe the technological part of decadence maybe is coming to an end, and so the vaccine is sort of a heightened version of, maybe there are going to be a bunch of breakthroughs that are different from just your iPhone and virtual reality. Maybe we are about to have some biomedical breakthroughs, some transportation breakthroughs, some energy breakthroughs that we haven't had, and this is part of the book's argument, in the last 40 years. So that's the positive side of the ledger. On the negative side, America has always been a tough place to govern, but the fact that like the US and Europe have both, in different ways but fundamentally similar ways, I think just totally failed to get the virus under control and figure out sort of social political strategies that sort of do what East Asian nations have been able to do. I think that's a real sign of institutional
That's what I thought was interesting with the Doherty point, which is that we stink at that.
Right. He's saying it's all connected, but
Germany's still lockdowns and we're vaccinating people, right? So like.
Right. No, the U.S. is definitely less decadent than Western Europe. I think there's sort of degrees. There are degrees.
So we're still number one.
We're still I mean, we're in a spot where we have you know, we're a little bit less governable than East Asian societies, but maybe we have a little more room for technological creativity.
Right.
Silicon Valley is sort of the one real center of technological dynamism. But I don't completely agree with him in that I think that, yeah, there's always going to be resistance to lockdowns and so on. But I think the America of, you know, the 1940s or even the 1960s would have probably done a better job of, you know, there have been versions of America that would have done a better job sort of mobilizing socially to figure out ways to do quarantines and these kind of things. And then also socially, I mean, we'll see what happens when the vaccine arrives, but socially, the disease has driven us deeper into screen world, virtual reality, away from marriage, sex, procreation.
Right.
You know, the birth rate is going to fall further. So yeah, it's sort of the technological side is sort of pulling us up out of decadence, and other things that have happened in the last years are sort of the weights pulling us down.
So I wanna close with a question which may sound a little crazy.
There are no crazy questions.
It's going to draw
only
on
crazy people.
on how you close out your book in a rather unexpected religious flight of imagination. I don't mean that in a criticism. Actually, meaning it was interesting to me. The exception to decadence that you describe, you write this, is Israel. Israel, you note, even among the secular citizens of Israel, have a high birth rate. I don't know if you focus on this, but it's a famously startup nation.
Yep.
To quote my friend Dan Senor's book. Incredible achievements, and go down the list of everything you describe. Your analysis of Israel, when you write about it, is sociological, meaning you don't bring religion into it, though you bring religion in a good way, on everything, but not on Israel, I think. And here's the crazy, I guess, biblical argument I want to make, and we'll call this a Douthathian argument about Zionism. So you end off by saying, you note that monotheism swept the world after Rome was suffused in decadence, and you end off by saying that maybe the West has been prepared for another moment like that. You say, quote, "I'm just saying that if this were the age in which some major divine intervention happened, whether long prophesied or completely unforeseen, there would be in hindsight a case that we should have seen it coming." I'm asking, and this draws on a distinct theme you see among some evangelicals in America. What if that is happening? Meaning, what if you had a people about which the Bible wrote, I'm just making this up hypothetically. Right, would be exiled and then one day return, the desert would bloom, cities rebuilt, Jerusalem reestablished, roads there. So Eric Cohn of Tikva has written a fascinating article basically saying that the attraction of many religious Americans to Israel and support for it is not just political, but it's not apocalyptic. It's a certain sense of that it's very opposition just in its own essence to so much of the deterioration morally and spiritually of the West, stands as sort of a beacon against the decadence you describe. Maybe that is, maybe that prophesied event is happening.
But so then what happens next?
So maybe this is there as to coin a phrase, a light unto the nations. Maybe the chosen people are now been asked by God to help the almost chosen people, to inspire them out of decadence. Come what may, I don't know.
I don't think that's a crazy idea at all.
Is that crazy?
I mean, I would say though, just to really sort of bring this full circle, you could see the Catholic integralists, whom you read with a certain understandable amount of historical skepticism, as themselves influenced by the experience of Israel, because Israel is, relative to other Western secular nations, a kind of,
though it doesn't seek empire, right?
Well, it's ambiguous. Yeah, it doesn't seek conquest, but it's a society that is, is sort of a liberal society on the one hand, but also one that does have, in some sense, right, an official religion, right? And this is, it's sort of a, it's, I think if you had the Catholic integralists sit down and actually hammer out the constitution of their Catholic republic, it could end up looking with, you know, the papacy playing the role of the rabbinate in Israel. And I think that this is, I think certainly this is true, you know, the sort of strange sort of, you know, friendships between Eastern European countries, right, Poland and Hungary, and like the Netanyahu government.
But it's not just those. It's as evangelical Christianity, you know,
right,
grows
but evangelical
in
Christianity isn't surprising.
In
it's
Brazil,
more,
right.
It's more the places that, you know, where there's
Right.
a history and some still
Right.
present
Right.
maintenance of anti-Semitism that are nonetheless sort of attracted to
Right.
an Israeli model.
I guess I'm saying this is not just a
religion.
model of what can work for other countries. It's not just a lesson in political science, but sort of a sign from God, in other words, that it is, as it were,
But that
a
means,
miracle.
right, but then it's Israel's job to colonize Mars, right?
Right. Maybe, well, that might
Because
happen.
it's either the Messiah or space travel. That's basically, that seems to me.
With the
those are-
dream of someone who grew up reading Paralandra of the two
Right,
joining
right, you-
together, obviously. That's the ultimate dream,
Right.
is a religious version of Star Trek. So, well, we can, that's where we're heading. So, on that
That's
very,
exactly
this is,
where I
I
wanted
think,
this
the
conversation
summit.
to
This is
end.
exactly on that summit of this intellectual height that we've reached. I want to thank you for an incredibly fascinating, incredibly candid conversation, Ross.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. The pleasure was really mine.